1913, a small group of Catholics gathered to celebrate the Holy Mass in a rented room above a proprietor's shop in Westerville, Ohio. In the 100 years that have followed, this modest group of 7 families who gathered in prayer, fellowship, and community has grown into the community of faith of St. Paul the Apostle Parish. From these humble beginnings, St. Paul now serves the faith of 4,700 families to become the largest Catholic parish in the Diocese of Columbus. Our parish is blessed to have a school that just recently celebrated the 50th anniversary of its founding. Our dedicated faculty and staff are committed to our tradition of nurturing the social, intellectual, and spiritual growth of the nearly 850 students we enroll each year. As its pastor, I have had the pleasure of shepherding our parish community through yet another important milestone, the building and 2011 dedication of our new beautiful church. This is our story.
Located in the northeastern corner of Franklin County, the city of Westerville, Ohio traces its history back over 100 years when Revolutionary War veteran Edward Phelps and his friend Isaac Griswold set forth from Connecticut in search of prosperity. Arriving in the new state of Ohio, these early homesteaders purchased 500 acres of land along the Alum Creek in Blendon Township in 1806. In 1809, Garrick Sharp and his family arrived from the east, establishing their residence further north of this earlier settlement, and within the confines of what is now considered the city limits of modern Westerville. Around 1815, brothers Matthew and Peter Westervelt left New York in search of their own prosperity and headed toward the western fringes of the young United States. Finding cheap and fertile land along the eastern bank of the Alum Creek, Matthew and Peter purchased 890 acres of land in January 1816 for $3,500, acreage destined to become the city of Westerville. The Westervelt family continued to play a prominent role in these early years. The family donated land for the first permanent Methodist church, built in 1836, and platted the town in 1839, defining the early boundaries of the small village. For their efforts, leadership, and generosity, the village was named Westerville in their honor. In the original town plans, Matthew Westervelt and his family donated 25 acres of land for the establishment of Blendon Young Men's Seminary, a short-lived Methodist school chartered in 1839 to train young men to minister to the faithful and evangelize to the Native American tribes still found throughout the region. Upon establishing Ohio Wesleyan University in nearby Delaware County in 1842, their first Ohio-based college, the Methodist Church opted to discontinue financial assistance to the Westerville-based seminary, but in doing so wrote that they remained confident that the enterprising brethren of Blendon will be able to place the institution on a broad and permanent basis. Unfortunately, the unplanned decision by the church forced the seminary to shutter its doors in 1844. For the many years that followed, Westerville would remain deeply rooted in the Methodist faith and traditions. In 1844, the United Brethren Church purchased the property from the Methodist Church and opened Otterbein University in 1847, the church's first institution of higher learning in the country. 10 years later, enrollment at Otterbein had grown to 249 students. Nearly 170 years later, the university boasts an enrollment nearing 3,000 students and a long tradition of contributing to the intellectual, cultural, and economic growth of the community of Westerville. In 1858, 87 citizens, 2 Westervelds among them, petitioned and secured permission from Franklin County Commissioners for the incorporation of Westerville as a village. By the 1870s, Westerville was developing into a thriving community. Streetcars ran along the major streets, and a railroad connected Westerville to Columbus and further points north. The first telephone line reached Westerville in the following decade, and by the early 20th century, the community boasted electric streetlights, water and sewage plants, and brick streets. As elsewhere across the country, Central Ohio witnessed a population surge during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as immigrants poured into the United States. The arrival of German, Irish, and Italian families into Central Ohio pressed the resources of Columbus's young Bishop James Hartley to meet their sacramental needs throughout the Diocese of Columbus. Responding to the growing community of Catholics, Bishop Hartley called upon Father Hugh Ewing. Father Ewing was pastor of St. Peter's Church, a church then located on the northern east side of Columbus. A particular note, Ewing was the son of a prominent family of Lancaster, Ohio, many of whom had distinguished themselves in their service to the Union Army during the American Civil War. One of Ewing's most notable relatives was his uncle, General William Tecumseh Sherman. In 1913, the original St. Peter's Church, then located near modern-day 5th and Cleveland Avenues, was the closest Catholic church to Westerville. Asked by Bishop Hartley, Ewing established a mission in Westerville, offering the sacraments and religious instruction to the small number of Catholic families in the surrounding areas. In May 1913, Ewing rented a Westerville storeroom located at 10.5 West College Avenue to host Sunday school. This modest space quickly proved inadequate, though, for these early gatherings, and shortly thereafter he rented 2 rooms at 7.5 North State Street, one over a bakery, the other over a pool hall. On September 28, 1913, 7 Westerville families joined Father Ewing for the celebration of the Holy Mass for the very first time in local history. Recognizing his efforts, Bishop Hartley granted the privilege to this itinerant pastor of naming the new mission community. Father Ewing obliged by naming the Westerville Mission under the patronage of St. Paul the Apostle. Declining health prompted Father Ewing to ask his assistant, Father Conrad Conradi, to assume pastoral care of the fledgling St. Paul Mission. Born in Luxembourg, Father Conradi had come to the U.S. as a young student to study for the priesthood under Father Joseph Jessing, founder of the Pontifical College Josephinum. Later joining its faculty as professor of classic languages, Father Conradi traveled each week from the Josephinum's original location in Columbus to shepherd the growing mission of St. Paul's until 1931. At the invitation of Bishop Hartley, the Capuchin friars arrived in Westerville in April 1931 to steward St. Paul's mission through the next steps of its growth. With contributions from its parishioners and the diocese, a stately home located north of residential Westerville and the surrounding acreage was purchased. The home, originally built in 1854 by the family of Garrick Sharp, boasted 13 spacious rooms and served as the monastery for the Capuchin priests. By September of 1931, the Capuchins had completed construction of St. Paul's first church. A modest wooden-frame church, it spaciously seated 150 people and cost $20,000. Dedicated in November 1931 by Bishop Hartley, this modest structure ably served the evolving needs of St. Paul's, first as a church, then meeting spaces, school cafeteria, and gymnasium for the next 65 years. In August of 1951, after 20 years of faithful service, the Capuchin friars relinquished administration of the mission, and pastoral responsibility was officially transferred to the Diocese of Columbus under the leadership of Bishop Michael Reedy. In September of that year, Bishop Reedy appointed Father Paul Hammer as the first diocesan pastor of St. Paul the Apostle, a milestone marking the transformation of a mission into a parish. Father Hammer, a graduate and then faculty at St. Charles Seminary in Columbus, served St. Paul's until January 1958, following his death from a lingering illness. In February 1958, newly installed Bishop Clarence Issenman appointed Father William McEwen as St. Paul's next pastor. Having served as an assistant at St. Rose Parish in New Lexington, Father McEwen was greeted by a parish of nearly 100 families when he arrived in Westerville. Inheriting the still infant church, Father McEwen would lead St. Paul's through a decade of unprecedented growth and change. Looking out over his young and growing congregation, Father McEwen quickly realized the value a parish school would bring. In the late 1950s, St. Paul parishioners wishing to provide their children with a Catholic education had few convenient options. As early as the mid-1940s, St. Paul's shuttled children to several Catholic schools in Columbus, including Immaculate Conception, St. James the Less, and St. Peter's. Determined to address this local need, Father McEwen spearheaded plans to open a parish school. With permission from the bishop, Father McEwen purchased 5 acres of land adjacent to the original church and commissioned extensive renovations to the now 100-year-old residence that had served the Capuchin friars in earlier decades. Father McEwen then turned to the 250 parish families, hoping to raise a portion of the $150,000 needed to build the planned 8-classroom school. Finding religious sisters willing to teach and manage the school was his next priority, something that even in the late 1950s was not an easy task. By Christmas 1959, McEwen was able to announce to the parish that the Sisters of Notre Dame had agreed to come and serve. In the fall of 1960, building plans were finalized and approved, and on Sunday, March 5, 1961, Father McEwen and invited church and city leaders broke ground to much excitement. In August 1961, 4 Notre Dame sisters arrived in Westerville with all their earthly possessions packed tightly in a station wagon. Excited by the opportunities that lie ahead, the sisters quickly settled into the modest accommodations that the parish afforded them and immediately began planning the organization of the school. Joined by 3 lay teachers, the modest teaching staff of 7 welcomed 218 children through the doors of the new St. Paul the Apostle School for the first time on September 6, 1961. The Sisters of Notre Dame remained faithful caretakers of St. Paul's School for the next 15 years before their community left in 1975. From these humble beginnings, the community of St. Paul's School has flourished in nurturing the growth of the innumerable young children that have passed through its doors in the 50 years that followed. Student enrollment has grown nearly fourfold to 860 students since these early days, and the modest staff of 7 in 1961 has blossomed to over 60 teaching and administrative professionals. By the mid-1960s, the parish had grown to nearly 500 families, stressing the capacity of the original wooden-frame church that had served the Young Mission for over 35 years. In the summer of 1967, an official announcement came approving plans for a second church, followed by a groundbreaking ceremony on August 13, 1967. Designed of native fieldstone and wood, the new church reflected the spirit of Vatican II in its contemporary design. Dedicated on May 4, 1969, the new church cost $500,000 to build and could comfortably seat over 780 parishioners. Over the 12 years that Father McEwen served St. Paul's, the 100 families that welcomed his arrival in 1958 had grown to 750 families when he said his goodbyes in June of 1970. Leading the parish through its 1960s growth spurt, it was no surprise that the community of St. Paul had great and long-lasting affection for Father Willie, their beloved pastor. In June 1970, Father Leo Sullivan was named pastor, but serious health problems cut his tenure short, and he was replaced shortly thereafter by Father Patrick Byrne in 1972. Having served as a chaplain in the U.S. Army Reserves, Father Byrne brought an astute and disciplined administrative style where, during his 3-year tenure, he focused on reducing the parish's debt load, a predicted outcome of the parish's growth in the preceding decade. During Father Byrne's tenure, attendance at weekend masses grew to 1,800, having nearly doubled in just 3 short years.
I can even give you the exact date. It was the 14th of October, 1975. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was finishing my 5 classes at Marian Catholic High School. Came back to the parish rectory, and the secretary said, "Father Fulcher wants you to call him." This is later Bishop Fulcher. He was chairman of the personnel board at the time. And he says to me, "Well," he says, "we understand you applied for a couple of small parishes. Probably a good idea." He says, now, don't say no. He said, I'm supposed to ask you for the personnel board if you would consider the idea of a co-pastorate at a slightly larger parish. So I sat there saying nothing. He says, are you there? I said, yeah. Well, you're not saying anything. I said, well, you told me I couldn't say no. Oh, he says. I said, all right, George, you have to tell me more about this. What are you really thinking? Well, he says, what we're thinking is St. Paul's in Westerville. Now, Bob White is the principal of the school there, and he wants to be pastor. So we're thinking about this idea of a co-pastorate where he could still be in charge of the school and somebody else would be in charge of the rest of the parish. What do you think? So I have no idea. Well, what do you think of him as a co-pastor? I said, I don't know. I've never met the man. Oh, well, call him, he says. Go down and see him. So all the rest of that afternoon and evening, I called right up to midnight. Never got an answer at St. Paul's, if you can imagine. Called the next morning, Wednesday morning. Made arrangements to come down and see him Thursday morning. So Thursday morning, I drove down after 6:30 Mass and spent the morning with Bob White. And driving back home at noon, I'm thinking, I don't know much more now than I did when I came down there. So I got back to St. Mary's in Marion, and as I came in the back door from the garage, the secretary was coming from the front door. Father Fulcher's on the phone, wants to talk to you. This was 2 days after the original call. Well, have you talked to him? Yeah. What do you think? Oh, I don't know. Oh, he says, well, sit on it. He says, we'll call you back in a month or so. We'll want to think about this. Okay. About 2 hours later, I get a buzz from the secretary again. Father Trainer's on the phone. Chancellor. Bishop wants to see you tomorrow at 1 o'clock. I said, I canceled most of my classes this week at the high school. I really shouldn't cancel anymore. Can we make it a little later in the day, some other time? No, Bishop wants to see you at 1 o'clock. You be here. So Friday, 3 days after the original call, I'm down at the Chancery office, and Bishop Herman has me in and says hello and sit down. And he says, I understand that the board talked to you about this possibility at Westerville. And I said, yeah. He says, what do you think? I says, I don't know. He says, will it work? I say, I don't know. And he says, do you want to move Wednesday or Thursday? Not counting kindergarten, there were 12 classrooms. 2 first grades, 2 second, 2 third, 2 fourth. 35 kids in each. 1 fifth grade, 6th, 7th, and 8th. 70 fourth graders ready to move on to a room of 35 kids in the fall for 5th grade. So first thing we had to do, the first thing was to make plans. There was some empty space in the building to readjust it, make temporary classrooms out of it, and try to at least adjust, which we did. We got one extra room that way and put the two 5th grade classes together and stretched it for a second year until we were able to finish the remodeling and expansion of the school building. But that was a major thing. I had to start almost immediately. Fund drive and planning for the expansion of the school. One thing I'm sure you'll appreciate is the very last meeting I had with the Diocesan Building Committee. They sat there when we were all finished and looked at me and said, we hope you understand this is the last building project that will ever be allowed at St. Paul's Church in Westerville. Okay. The superintendent of schools, Father Sorahan, called me at that point and said, we've got some Ursuline nuns that want to come back to the diocese. Think you might like to take them there at St. Paul's. I said, well, what can you tell me about them? Well, they're Ursulines. One of them's from Perry County, same as I am. They have to be good. I said, well, what else? Don't know another thing, except there's 3 of them. 3 Ursulines can fill in for 3 Sisters of Notre Dame. I finally said, well, Dave, what do you recommend? He says, I don't recommend. He says, I'm telling you to take them. So at that point, the Ursuline sisters came in for the fall. In the meantime, in the spring of that first year that I was there, so it was the spring of 76, Father White left. And I was never informed he was leaving. I was never actually appointed pastor. All the rest of my time there was legally co-pastor without a co. And away we went. When I went there officially on the roster, there were 1,428 households. By 1983, it had grown to 2,400, and that was the year that the bishop started St. John Newman and Resurrection parishes, both of which took away a fair-sized chunk of the parish. Cut us back down from 2,400 to about 1,900, and then when I left in 87, it was back up to 2,400 households again. So.
Father Arthur Wiles was named pastor of St. Paul's in June 1987, following the departure of Father Schlegel. Father Wiles arrived in Westerville after having served 10 years at Our Lady of Lourdes Parish in Ada, where he was also actively involved in campus ministry at Ohio Northern University. An avid scuba diver, Father Wiles is often remembered by St. Paul's parishioners for the hootenannies he hosted at the rectory, where interested parishioners gathered for song, storytelling, and fellowship. Father Wiles left St. Paul's in 1993 for St. Christopher's Church in Grandview, where he served until his untimely death in 2004.
Well, my first recollection is I was at St. Peter's, and I was set there to retire. I mean, I fulfilled the obligations that would let me stay there until I was 70. And I got the call from the bishop, and he asked me as I was sitting down. And I said, yeah, I'm sitting down. And he asked me to go over there. We talked about it a couple of times. And the thing that impressed me, it was large. And I found out later it was the 5th largest in the state of Ohio, and all the other ones were in Cleveland. And we had the largest grade school in the state of Ohio. With this huge school, we didn't have a cafeteria. And they were bringing the food in from the public school and then eating in the classrooms and taking it out. And that's why we decided to add to the school and to add that in building, which you now know, where it's a cafeteria and everything underneath it. But they were taking the kids over from the school and showing them where they used to hide these slaves in this building. Well, we wanted to tear it down. Of course, Westerville was very strict. You may remember Carol Wooten, who was the secretary there. Her daughter was going to Ohio State. And as a project, which she would get credit for, we had her make a study if there's anything valid about that this was part of the Underground Railroad. Because we were suspicious, because just south of us there was an authenticated building that had proved that there was no proof whatsoever, and the city of Westerville would not accept it. It had to be done by attorneys. So we had to pay $6,000 to get another study made, and came out with the exact same conclusion. But particularly Walt Miller, who was the principal at that time. He was very positive, and I think the parish saw him as someone holding the parish together in many, many ways.
Walt Miller, he was a really warm-hearted person, and he loved parties and Christmas. And I remember when we were leaving on Thanksgiving break, and he called down the hall, "Peggy, baby Jesus wants hung up," as he was so anxious for Advent to get here, for us to get going. One day, a baby goat, probably from Yarnell's farm, got loose on the playground, and the kids chased it, and of course that made it run even more. So finally it was caught, and Walt went out, got the goat, brought it in the building, and took it door to door so everybody could see the goat. And that's something none of us, I think, will ever forget. when Walt died, Ann O'Flynn became acting principal and then principal. She had been a first grade teacher for a long time, and Walt had asked her to move down to 8th grade, which she did. And she was sad to leave the first grade, but she grew to really love being with the 8th grade. So then he asked her to be his assistant, which was really prophetic on his part, because it made the transition very smooth, and Walt's all of the things he'd started could go right on. She did a wonderful job. I'm going to tell you one other funny little thing. One Monday morning, around 11 o'clock, Ann O'Flynn came in Monday morning, and she looked around and she said, "Well, thank God it's Friday." And I will never forget that. Many Mondays I have felt like that. Wished I could say that. But for the most part, things go very smoothly. And when Ann retired, Dr. Kathleen Norris came.
So I got the call from one of the members of the personnel board on behalf of the bishop. And I was happy. I thought that this would be a place where I could use my talents well. I was really glad to be here. And it's always nice when you come on that first Sunday to say you wanted to be here, that you wanted to come to St. Paul's. So my first impression was this place is huge. And I also knew that I had to oversee the building of a new church, because that was logical. The bishop never said to me, "You have to build a new church." But in my conversations with Father Fairchild, I knew that this was something that was needed. And one day he said to me, "I did everything else, now you can build a church." So, and I was prepared for that, and it was an exciting challenge for me. When I was here as a seminarian in 1982 to 83, which was a very rich experience, by the way, for me. And then but at that time there were 2,400 families, which is a pretty big parish. I arrived in 2003, I guess that's only 20 years. The parish had grown over 2,000 families. So it kept growing and growing and growing, and this was a very pleasant bedroom community for people who worked in Columbus and other parts of central Ohio. Deacon in 1982-83, before I was ordained a priest under Father Schlegel, the memory that I had of it, and that's why I applied to come back. I think that that is one of the hallmarks of our parish, the warmth and friendliness. And there's a tradition of that. At the same time, the people are very generous, and that shows in the building of the church, which is an undertaking that truly is remarkable. Even by the fall of 2003, which was just a few months after I arrived, I called Helmut Naunheimer, who is now our development director, and asked him if he would consider doing the fund drive for our parish building project. At the time, he was the development director at Hartley High School on the east side, and he kindly said yes. In the spring of 2004, in May, we met for the first time with the planning committee that was set up to oversee the beginning of the project and to make suggestions about that. A couple of really important things that we did. We did a survey of the parish, which showed what the people would like to see in terms of the building project, not only with respect to the church, but also with respect to what else we might need on our campus. And then the second thing that we did was to kind of try to look into the future, some demographic projections, and felt that we had a fairly decent handle on how the parish was going to grow and how many people would be here over the next few decades. And that would help us to know what size church to build. And people were very generous and kept responding. And there were some interesting stories. One woman said to me, "Well, Father, you have to pray that my car will last a few more years, because I gave up getting a new car because I'm going to give to the building fund. And we also had one young man who gave us half of his first communion take one year. The gifts that people gave him, the money gifts, he gave us half of that. And so he served the dedication, by the way, because by the time the church was finished, he was old enough to serve. Being in the church during the time of the construction was a very exciting thing, which the building committee did almost weekly. We came into the church to inspect, and to be awed by it, and to make suggestions sometimes, and just to enjoy what was happening there before our eyes, which was a monumental project beyond our wildest imaginations, really. And of course, everybody loved it all the way along, and the people loved it from the time of the dedication until now. Not only about building this building, which is extremely important as a place to worship God, but also we thought about the small church community process. So we're still going to have some building to do. There's always more to do, and we're still doing some little things to complete even the building of the church. Foreseeable future, I think that we're going to be orienting the parish more and more in the direction of this faith-sharing small church community process.
Congratulate you and ask God's blessing upon you and many, many more years in the future.
It's just been a joy to be here at St. Paul all this time. I've loved seeing the children, parents I had taught. That is always fun to have them come back and see your students, children come back and be your students. Wonderful families. I think it's a real tribute that so many families continue to send their children and their grandchildren to this school. It says a lot about it. The school has just grown by leaps and bounds. I think it's a beautiful school. I'm always very proud of it.
Great things going on, great future ahead. But on the other end, you can look back and say, look how many people had to do how much for how long to just bring us to where we are. From this whole idea of starting upstairs in uptown Westerville, the little wooden church there, to the other one that lasted for so long, and now look at us now, look what's happened to the school. It's just wonderful things to look back on and see how they've happened. It's hey, you're doing great things, keep it up.